thank you to everyone for joining First Draft's Reporting on Coronavirus webinar series. Just to introduce the organization a bit, First Draft is a global organization that seeks to empower societies with accurate information in critical moments. So we work with journalists, academics, technologists, and the general public to ensure the integrity of our information ecosystem. We develop and deliver pioneering techniques, tools, and training for how information is discovered, shared, and then presented to the public. So my name is Victoria Kwan. I'm the Ethics and Standards Editor here at First Draft. Today we will be discussing mental wellness and vicarious trauma in the age of coronavirus. And I'm joined here by Sam Dubberly, who leads Amnesty International's Crisis Evidence Lab and manages the Digital Verification Core program. Sam is one of First Draft's founding partners and co-wrote our report on journalism and vicarious trauma. We're also joined here by Lydia Moorish, a journalist at First Draft who has recently written about mental wellness for journalists reporting on COVID-19, although the lessons are applicable also to many other industries as well. And so we'll share the links with you at the end of the session. So to get started, the first thing I wanted to say is that I hope that everyone on the call today and your families and your communities are staying safe and healthy. I also wanted to say that your work has never been more important because more than ever in this moment, the public needs accurate and up-to-date information so that they can make informed decisions about their health. And governments and other institutions also need this information so that they can enact policies to protect us and to improve the qualities of our lives. So it's incredibly important that everyone on the call knows that what you are providing is essential at a time like this. At the same time, we wanted to acknowledge how challenging it is to do this work when it feels like the world is shifting underneath your feet. So for many of us in the session, our day-to-day workload may now involve looking at seemingly endless qualities of coronavirus-related content. For me, I know that this has certainly been the case. An average workday for me now means staying on top of the latest coronavirus developments, gathering examples of how it's all covered in the news, monitoring social media for mis and disinformation. And in many ways, I find this the most meaningful and exhilarating work of my career, but at the same time, reading all these stories about human suffering and institutional failure, and frankly, being exposed to so many conspiracy theories in the course of my monitoring work can also leave me feeling tired and drained and a little bit overwhelmed. And I think that working from home has also exaggerated some of these feelings and added a little bit to the isolation. So, that's where I'm coming from, but I'm curious how it's been for you at the Crisis Evidence Lab, Sam.
Thanks, Victoria, and thanks everyone for joining us today. And I just echo Victoria's comments there about, I hope everybody who's on the call and everybody in general is well and safe, and everyone's family is doing okay at this time. I think this has been, for everybody, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say one of the most challenging times in anybody's career. I come from a journalism background, a broadcast news background, and I now work for a human rights organization. And I think one of the most striking things about this is, I've been privileged enough, and I think privilege is a very important word here. I've been privileged enough to have a career dedicated to watching humanity, and in international news, international affairs, and international human rights monitoring. That has meant looking at some of the worst things that that humanity has done to each other or has experienced through natural disasters. And I think that this is one of the first times, I think for me, I've always done it from newsrooms. I've always done it from working in the headquarters of a news organization, be it in London, be it in Geneva, be it where I am now in Berlin, where, yes, I've been able to watch what's going on and report on what's going on and work on what's going on, but I've always had the privilege of being able to leave it behind me at the end of the day. And I think that probably, if we work in the First Draft organization, if you work in a lot of news organizations, behind the scenes, foreign correspondents aside, or researchers who go into the field aside, this is the first time I think we're reporting a lot of these things while we're also ourselves experiencing danger. And I think that's no small thing. I think that's a really, it's a really destabilizing thing that a lot of us, and myself included, have had to get used to. That our work carries on and we carry on doing what we're doing because it's our job and it's a privilege to be our job. But at the same time, we are worried for, our loved ones, our families, our own safety. And I think that's been really destabilizing. And I think for myself, the first couple of weeks of the shutdown, I'm based in Germany, in Berlin. The first couple of weeks of the shutdown, I think it saw a rise in my own anxiety of the like I've never seen before. Now, thankfully, I've been able to, stabilize that a little bit, and I'm kind of doing a lot better. But I think I just want to acknowledge that, for myself, this was a really horrible thing, which was crippling in many ways. It was really stopping me being able to focus on anything outside that. I think I've taken some proactive steps to reduce that, and maybe we can go into some of what those look like as we go on through the discussion. And I think it's also been a big challenge, but and we'll come on to this later as well, Victoria, is adapting to what a dispersed team looks like. And for many journalists, I think, many people working in newsrooms, the idea of a dispersed team putting a news bulletin together, putting a newspaper together, is something that's been very, very alien and very new. With our team at Amnesty, actually, the crisis response team at Amnesty, we've always been a dispersed team. So, we've been working for the last 3 to 4 years anyway in supporting each other through working in crises. I mean, our team name kind of gives away what we work on. We work on, any crisis that impacts human rights and people's right to enjoy their human rights anywhere in the world. But we've been working for a long time on being a dispersed team. And even then, it's brought with it a lot of, this situation has brought with it a lot of new challenges. And we were in a pretty good place to actually adapt to being a dispersed team right from the start. So, I think it's a situation which is deeply unusual, feels belittling to what the situation is, but it is deeply unusual. And I think it's brought up new challenges around the well-being of ourselves, of our teams, of our colleagues, of our friends, of the like we've never had to face before.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for that, Sam. It's a really good point about how, working in a dispersed organization, which I know your team has had like a experience with, but for myself and probably for many participants on this call, like this is all very new to us. And so especially with like the subject matter of the work now, I feel like when I conduct work around a topic like coronavirus that involves a lot of illness and like death, and reading or reading about stories of like isolation and like sadness, it can feel really hard for me to not feel like affected by the suffering of others. And like normally when I'm actually in a newsroom or at the office with my coworkers, like they're I think as an extrovert, being around people like kind of helps alleviate that pressure a little bit. But then especially, as you said, like with work from home, it's been a massive adjustment. So, so thinking about all of that and like the potential of like vicarious trauma, I wanted to ask you, Sam, because you've been talking about and writing about vicarious trauma for years. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what exactly that is and how it might be triggered by our work on COVID-19.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so my work around vicarious trauma has been very much around, the kind of covering of conflict and the emergence of recording of conflict and crisis through social media. So through mostly videos, photos shared to social media of airstrikes in Syria, or children being killed in Yemen, or wherever in the world, covering protest and so on and so forth, land grabs, anything like that. And I think it's something that's impacted both journalism and the human rights space and human rights research since really social media took off 10, 15 years ago. In a way that never vicarious trauma is something an idea which came out of the 1970s and covering of the Vietnam conflict and journalists in the Vietnam conflict. but the scale of it, the scale of information which emerged from the the phenomenon of YouTube, and the idea that there's more hours of the Syrian conflict on YouTube than there have been hours of the Syrian conflict. So kind of the idea that we sitting in newsrooms in London, wherever, New York, wherever, we are now on a digital front line. And I think that translates very, very neatly and very clearly into what we're experiencing now through COVID-19. Except I think there's a new area which we've already seen it coming, and I think some of the first draft work into hate speech online, some of the groups that the first draft has been investigating as spreading disinformation, but also spreading hate speech, has been a kind of a foreground for this, where actually it's as much looking at the videos as now reading stories. And I think you kind of went into that really nicely, Victoria. That actually a lot of what's going on we can't see now. We're kind of back to a world where we don't see what's going on in intensive care units, thankfully, but we read about it. And I think the understanding that vicarious trauma is it's something that you experience trauma not by being there, not by physically being there, but by experiencing it through somebody else. And the fact that this actually can have as much of an impact on you as seeing trauma firsthand, or witnessing trauma firsthand, or experiencing trauma firsthand. So when we did the initial research into the impact of vicarious trauma on newsrooms and on human rights investigators, kind of the precursor to First Draft, which was called Eyewitness Media Hub, back in 2015, it was very much this idea that there is a physical front line and there's a digital front line, and the kind of idea of you can be on the physical front line witnessing an event and be traumatized, but you can also be on the digital front line witnessing an event and being traumatized. Now we looked very much at the idea of audiovisual content at that time, but I think certainly for myself, with the COVID-19 stuff, I'm actually looking at videos. We're looking at content from, there's been a massive emergence in certain parts of the world, so Latin America, Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, of excessive use of force by the police in kind of shutting down curfews, or ensuring curfews are respected, or shutting down kind of like people on the streets, and they've been using excessive violence. So there are videos of repression of rights out there. But it's reading the stories, which is really being kind of the trigger, and the fact that we can relate to these very much as if we're there, and also I think one of the personal kind of impacts of this has been excellent journalism. People telling stories in a really excellent way is actually becoming deeply traumatic. So the vicarious trauma side is very much that your body responds as if you are there. And you've put that up on the slides quite nicely, but I think your body responds as if you're there and you're actually being, impacted by that. I think it's important though to understand, and Bruce Shapiro of the Dart Center speaks about this very well, that having distress in these situations per se, is not a sign of something serious, right? It's a very, stories like these are very upsetting by the very nature of the subject of the story. So like being upset, being anxious is a very normal human response to these stories, right? But it's, and you need to look after yourself, right? And vicarious trauma and trauma in general is it's a bit like being exposed to radiation, right? It's a drip, 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 drip. So it's why it's really important to look after ourselves all the time in this period, because an individual exposure, an individual moment of distress, an individual moment of coming home and crying, or coming home and crying, being at home and crying, it's like moving from the spare room into the living room. And crying, or feeling deeply frustrated, or having a big argument with your partner, that's a very, very normal way very, very normal and very, very human reaction. It's if this carries on over a long period of time. And DSM-5, basically the holy book of the American Psychiatric Association, talks about the fact that for post-traumatic stress disorder, so if you take vicarious trauma to its ultimate end, which is, vicarious trauma is a pathway to post-traumatic stress disorder. 4 things have to be present 30 days after exposure. So actually, ending up with PTSD is quite a big step to actually have to get through. But actually having that kind of like moment, the kind of distress in the moment is a very normal thing. You have to look after it, but they're not necessarily signs that you need external help.
Right. Yeah, and that's really interesting about sometimes like reading the text can be much more like distressing than like the imagery, especially when we don't really like see what's like going on in the hospitals, as you said. I also find myself like really stressed out sometimes by the data, like by the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And even though the numbers by definition are not really so much about individuals' stories specifically, but just seeing those like the rising lines and like the different like charts and like graphs, or just seeing like the the number of like deaths or diagnosed like cases that go up in some of these trackers and like dashboards actually gives me like quite a lot of anxiety. But I think it's really important, like what you said about vicarious trauma, or feeling emotional like distress at others suffering is a sign that we have empathy, and it's quite normal to feel like upset and like anxious in these situations. So some of the signs that you talked about, signs of vicarious trauma, include psychological signs, like having intrusive thoughts and like images just pop into your head unbidden, having disturbed like sleep, feeling cynicism, like fear or anger, or like problems concentrating, or feeling numb. There might be like changes in your own behavior or the way you relate to others, as you said, like withdrawing from friends and family, or having like difficulty keeping the boundaries between your work and your personal life. And there's also physical signs as well, like headaches or feeling fatigue or changes in your appetite. So I guess like the next question then is, now that we've kind of talked a little bit about what vicarious trauma is and what the signs are, the next question is, what can we do to prevent or like respond to vicarious trauma, and just to maintain like our like mental wellness overall? And I really wanted to get your thoughts, Sam, on what we can do to take care of ourselves, both during and outside of work hours, because as you mentioned, part of the challenge for me is that when the workday ends, I don't feel like I get a break from the pandemic. I feel like it's a 24/7 story. And even if I, put the flap on my computer down, it's still coming up in chats with my family and my friends. My mom is still sending me WhatsApp messages about it. I'm really worried about the possibility of me or my loved ones contracting the disease, and it's all over my inbox, all over my social media feeds. I know I've talked to Lydia about this as well, like how even skincare, like makeup brands, like their newsletters are like mentioning COVID-19. So sometimes it can just feel like very overwhelming. So just kind of talk a little bit about what we can do to take care of ourselves would be really wonderful.
Yeah, sure. Before I do that, I'd just like to add one other thing to the previous slide, if I may, which I think is important, like to mention. It's certainly, I'm going to talk very personally here. In the first couple of days of the shutdown in Berlin, and not everybody not going, and those numbers going up, cases doubling by the day, et cetera, et cetera. I certainly found myself, I would call it stress drinking. And I think being aware of increasing self-medication is really important at the moment, and acknowledging that. I think that is a sign of vicarious trauma as well. And it's something, I picked up in myself pretty quickly, that, instead of like having one glass of wine with dinner, it was, several. And this wasn't good, because then it obviously, leads to disturbed sleep, leads to cynicism, leads to problems concentrating, and it becomes a really vicious cycle. So, I think one of those things that really people should be aware of is if they are, stress self-medicating, I would say. Anyway, so just to add that in there as well. So going forward into what one can do, what one can do. I mean, I think, when we talk about vicarious trauma and recognizing vicarious trauma, even pre-COVID, I mean, I think the number one thing is just noticing what's there and naming it. I think, acknowledging to yourself that, this is a unique moment in global history. It's probably going to be, a unique moment for our lifetimes. And it's kind of like, it is deeply stressful, and the work we do is deeply stressful, and that we need to notice that and name it, I think is really, really, really important. And it sounds so obvious, right? It sounds so damned obvious, but it's amazing how often we don't do that, right? It's amazing how often we're wired for shortcuts, right? We're wired to take as many shortcuts as we can as human beings, and we don't acknowledge the obvious quite a lot of the time. And I'm going to play the gender card here as well, and I think men are even worse at acknowledging these things and naming these things than anybody else. So that's really important. So awareness of, I'm working on this thing that's deeply stressful, that I have no escape from it. It's my job. And as you said, Victoria, it infiltrates into my private life. When I'm working on, the siege of Aleppo, that doesn't tend to infiltrate into my private life, right? It's like there's there's blurring, sure, in the idea of, work-life balance is rubbish anyway, I think. There's blurring, but there's definite disassociation, right? My mum's not going to be asking me about, figures from Aleppo, but she is telling me about figures from my hometown on COVID-19. So I think that's a number one thing. I think the other issues are, I mean, going back to the kind of like self-medication, to put it in a nice way, being aware of that, and one of the first things I did actually was, as somebody who's wanted to cut down on drinking for a while anyway, it was like, oh, wait a minute. My excuse for drinking too much is always like, oh, my social life is so busy. Well, I have no social life now. Like, let's stop. So, when I saw that increasing, it was one of the first things I did. Oh, actually, this is the chance to actually, walk the talk, so to speak, and I'm going to stop drinking for the whole of this period. That's been super helpful. I'm not saying that that people need to stop drinking, but maybe at least looking at moderating that if you are somebody who likes a glass of wine with dinner. I think acknowledging also that the anxiety is a very normal thing is really important. And I think the other thing that I think as journalists in particular, we need to be really careful about at the moment, especially of that blurring between work and private life. If we're lucky, leaving the office means going from the spare room into the living room, and for a lot of people, it doesn't even mean that. It means just like shutting down the laptop. We have to be wary of the notifications. I think exposing ourselves to a notification overload is really easy, and it's one of the easiest things that we can actually manage ourselves. And I think going back to what you were saying, Victoria, about looking at the numbers, looking at the peaking graphs, we're paying attention then to things we can't control. We can't control those numbers. We can't change those numbers. We can make our own small contribution towards trying to not make them go up by staying at home and washing our hands, etc., etc. But that's it. So actually monitoring those numbers on a daily basis, it actually serves very little purpose, except kind of fueling anxiety, I think. So, if they're part of your job, and obviously it's important that we're aware of it and so on and so forth, but if it's part of our job, then it's something we should be making sure we don't let blur into our private lives. And one of the first tactics I implemented, and I encouraged my team to implement, was we're on, we start work at this time and we finish work at this time.
Mm-hmm.
And after this time, we turn off our notifications. And even when you're at work, work out which notifications we need to have on and not have on. So, I took Twitter off my phone because it was just doing too much. I mute WhatsApp channels that are, friend WhatsApp channels that are incessantly chatting about COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
All those little steps, I think, add up to something a lot bigger, which is around self-care and looking after ourselves. So on an individual basis, I think we can take those steps quite easily ourselves. I think as teams, as looking after our colleagues,
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot we can do as well. I don't know if you want to come to that now or come into that later.
Yeah, so no, that's an incredibly important piece of the puzzle as well. We'll definitely get to that in a minute. I just wanted to bring in like Lydia a little bit for a little bit as well to talk about her recent piece on how journalists can look out for themselves, because Lydia had written 2 pieces, one on self-care and one on how organizations and managers can look out for their staff. And so Lydia, I know your article was about reporters specifically, but there are broader lessons in there that apply to researchers and other types of jobs as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Victoria. Thanks, Sam. And thank you to everyone who's on the call. Yeah, so my points really build off of what Sam's talked through. But yeah, journalists, researchers, and any kind of like information seekers, we are used to dealing with tough subjects, whether that's stories or data. But yeah, it's really important to remind ourselves that experiencing any kind of mental health issues around these, especially in this situation now, is not illustrative of your professional competence. Something quite powerful that Philip Eel, a freelance journalist who's written extensively on journalism and mental health, told me as a piece of advice was to know this work is likely to have an effect on you and be okay with that. I think it's really important just to register in terms of, yeah, there's so much about this world and particularly content we see online or through journalistic or research work, and that would make any healthy person stressed, anxious or depressed. And yeah, that's completely okay. We're only human. And also to build on the work-life balance and self-care stuff, it's really important to have designated periods of time where you just don't discuss coronavirus or anything in the news if that's disturbing you. So yeah, try to have a really clear distinction between work and social time. So I have a marker for the day, kind of what you said already, Sam. I close my laptop, I put it in my bag, and I put it away as if I was leaving the office. And having that kind of marker is really helpful. It could even be going for a walk or run if you can do that, or like playing an instrument, or just like pouring a glass of water, just having something that like separates your work day into the evening. And I spoke to Bruce Shapiro as part of some of my reporting, the director of the Dart Center, and he said to me, even if your beat isn't coronavirus at the moment, every journalist needs a self-care plan to get through this weird, like challenging period. So this could be the basics, like trying to get enough sleep, going offline before bed, or just, yeah, the little things that really keep you well.
Right.
And lastly, just, yeah, as many of us are now spending more time at home and out of the office in isolation, it's also really key to check in with colleagues, whether that's on a call or by messaging them and asking how they are. That's a really great way of bringing up the topic.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Lydia. Yeah, it's so important the part about relying on people you trust, like for support, whether it's family or friends or like colleagues who will know better than almost anyone else, like what you're going through because they're in the same like situation. So for me, it's also good to kind of give myself like the affirmation like every day that what I'm doing is incredibly like important. And it's normal for me to like feel like angry or frustrated or sad in this situation, but like in many ways I feel like the organization that I work at, like, you know, we were built for like a time like this. And so the work that the service we provide is like absolutely essential. And that is a huge part of, you know, what helps me like keep going and like maintain my own mental health like in this situation. So at this point, before we move on to what newsrooms can do, or organizations, other information providers can do for their staff, I'd like to bring in Nell and see if we have any questions from our audience.
We have a journalism educator wondering how to translate this great advice specifically to younger collegiate student journalists.
Yeah, well, Sam is in a really great place to answer this, because as part of your journalism and vicarious trauma report, like, you did have a section for student journalists and for you know, journalism professors as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it must be so hard and so confusing for anybody who's going through any form of education in the moment, never mind a journalism course. So I mean, I think this is, again, these are really exceptional times. What I would say is, I mean, I think any advice that is given to a newsroom, or any advice that's given to any journalist at the moment, should be basically translated into those students. And what I would recommend is, I mean, it's something I've always recommended around vicarious trauma anyway, where I think, you know, my research is suggestive, and I don't know who's asking the question, so I apologize if you do this anyway, where trauma has never been talked about or rarely talked about in journalism degrees at universities. And I think, you know, if one thing came out of this mildly positive, would be, you know, that journalism degrees, and I would say the same for human rights degrees, applied human rights degrees, that this idea of needing to talk about trauma really comes to the fore, and needing to prepare, you know, people who are about to go out into the world and work in newsrooms, or work on beats, and work on any beat. You know, this should be the moment when we understand that trauma has to be part of the curriculum. And this is a time for anybody who cares about making it so, to put that argument forward. You know, same goes for human rights, human resource departments in organizations, and we'll come on to that in a second. But this is the moment to get that in place. I've seen it in too many times in university degrees, where, you know, they've got a module on trauma, but it gets forgotten about because, you know, it's more important to spend another day on that, you know, end of year assignment, or in internal trainings in organizations where, you know, it's like we've got an hour on trauma, but hey, that thing overran and that guy came late, so, you know, that's a bit we'll drop. I think now is the time to reinforce that this is key. This is really, really important. And you know, as Victoria alluded to, like any journalist, Lydia alluded to with her discussion with Bruce, you know, any journalist doing anything needs to have a plan in place, and that applies equally to students now as to people working on the beat. So I'd really just push for it to be included.
Great, thank you so much for that. So that's a really great segue to our next section, because as you mentioned, like Sam, in this environment, it's the responsibility to look out for well-being. It's not just on the individual, it's also on the organization, on managers, on human resources, to really look out for their staff. And we have to create an environment in which staff can successfully do all of these self-care tips that we just recommended. So having buy-in from the top levels of management is especially crucial, because there really needs to be a genuine concern for employee well-being, and a commitment to creating spaces where staff can really feel safe and supported, which is, you know, not always like an easy thing to manage when we're all working from home, and there just seems to be like so much like information to like process and like analyze. But, you know, it is like really a really important thing to keep in mind. So I just wanted to get your thoughts, Sam, on how Amnesty International and how the Crisis Evidence Lab has like managed that as an organization, but also what you as a manager can do for your reports to ensure that they're staying mentally well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I don't have a SoundCloud, but I'm going to do that awful thing of plug a book. Recently we published a book I published a book edited with two colleagues through Oxford University Press, called Digital Witness. So the educator who asked the question before might be interested, because it's aimed very much at universities. Anyway, but in that book we have a chapter on vicarious trauma, where we actually talk about general risk factors towards individuals, and we go through a long list, many of which we've covered already. But one of those things is, and I'm going to quote, poor working conditions increase the chances of PTSD amongst trauma-exposed employees. So people who are exposed to risk of trauma, poor working conditions actually increase that risk of trauma and traumatization. So never before has a need for organizations to actually understand their staff, work with their staff, lead from the front on trauma being more important. And I think one of the things that came through out of any research into vicarious trauma that I have done is that the only way really for it to be implemented well, to look after staff working in newsrooms, human rights organizations, has been for the senior management, and I really mean senior management, to lead on this from the front. And I think if you don't have senior management engagement, any other initiatives are going to fail, are bound to fail in some way or other, because somebody at the top doesn't show up. That means, their deputy doesn't have to show up, which means somebody, and then it kind of all comes crumbling down. So I think leading from the front is really, really important. In our team, I think, we, as I said before, we have an experience of being a dispersed team working on crisis situations. And how we've managed that is, we do a lot of our work on Slack, and we've carved out spaces within those groups for a long time now to share. It's kind of like the water cooler channel on Slack, where we doesn't have that name. The name of that channel cannot be repeated for public consumption, but it's a place where we share jokes, silly memes, dog pictures, cat pictures, etc., 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 make fun of the world. And those channels become, at this moment in time, even more important. I think, that you talked about it as an extrovert, Victoria, of like that need for connection. And I think this period is showing us a need for connection, and that we are social beings, and we do, when you read, all people miss is a hug, right? All people are missing is a hug at the moment. So how do you replicate that? Well, you can do it through having a Slack channel where the whole team is involved, and there's no expectation, but we can have chats around that. And I think alongside that, there are other platforms as well. And I think you shouldn't ever shy away from using multiple platforms for this, because people interact with different platforms in different ways. So alongside our Slack channel, we also have a WhatsApp group, which is, and strangely, without planning it, the Slack channel has become about memes and funny animal pictures, and the WhatsApp channel has become about pictures of kids, or pictures of pets, or pictures of what somebody's cooked tonight, and that's great as well. And within that, it gets kind of segmented down into smaller groups, and I think that's fine too. It's like we all have our particular friendship groups at work, and it should be encouraged. We should be encouraged to keep that going. Right. And that's kind of like the social side of things we can do. I think one of the things that organizations also have to do is make sure that their human resources policies are in place to protect people at this stage. Our team has had the issues of dealing people who recently have been sick, right? And that's a very worrying thing, because talking about things that are out of your control, we don't know why they were sick. It wasn't ever, thankfully, touch wood, it wasn't ever so bad that somebody needed to get tested or anything like that. But it does confront us with new challenges, right? And so those old ideas of so in Germany, 3 days off work, you have to bring in a doctor's note to say why you're off work. No. I think no organization worth its salt should be insisting on any kind of doctor's notes at the moment. Now is the time to trust your staff. Now is the time to trust that people are responsible individuals who care about their work and are moving forward as best they can. And now is not the time to be asking for sick notes or anything like that. Now is also not the time to be pushing people on performance, right? Other organizations, a very good organization I've done a lot of work with called the Engine Room has basically come out and said, you know, if you manage 50% in a day, that's great. If you manage more than that, even better, but there's no pressure to do so at all. And I think like having policies like that in place are really important at the moment. You know, because going back to what I just said before, you know, if you have bad working situations, if you have, you know, bad policies in place, this is going to, you know, those who are susceptible to trauma and to being traumatized here are going to be even more traumatized by having to kind of fulfill those kind of normal kind of steps of bureaucracy. If somebody had vacation planned, you know, they don't have that vacation anymore, and they're just going to keep on working, right? It's like there should be no expectation that anybody who planned to take next week off because it's Easter and now says like, well, I don't want to just sit at home in my flat and take vacation, saves it for last year. No questions asked. You should be just saying yes, that's fine. I think those are kind of the most important things I would see at the moment. I think also, you know, as a manager myself, it's a manager of a dispersed team. It's making sure that you understand as a manager how people like to be checked in on. Those check-ins are really important, but it's also like understanding, well, you know, Tom likes a WhatsApp message, you know, Paula likes a Slack message, you know, somebody else likes a phone call. And adapting to that and really understanding how your team works has never been more important. You know, you as a manager should be adapting to the needs of your team, not the other way around. And I think that's, you know, one big lesson that we should be learning from this.
Right. No, thank you for that. That is really important about just knowing, thinking about what your team is like as individuals and like how they like to be like communicated with, or, you know, any sort of a, you know, background challenges that they might be dealing with. I also, as part of like First Draft's own internal guidance on mental wellness, like I like to remind managers to thank their reports often and remind them that their work really matters, especially, you know, in this moment. So especially I think with working from home, where a lot of times the background work that people do can feel a little bit invisible, or it certainly becomes like less visible like with work from home. So it's important to sort of acknowledge like to your staff like early and often that you appreciate their efforts and that what they do is like very meaningful. I also wanted to bring Lydia in at this point because as mentioned earlier, she's also written a piece about how newsrooms can help protect their employees. And you interviewed several senior staff at different organizations and asked how they've been caring for employees. So I just wanted to ask you for some of the most important points from those conversations.
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the key things that came up was the importance of raising awareness of mental health and well-being in the workplace. So because there is like the general discomfort and stigma around mental health and well-being, it might not be a topic that everyone wants to address personally or even talk about with colleagues or managers. But through talking to Natalia Antalava, the editor-in-chief of Coda Story, she said one of the most important things for editors to do was to make everyone aware that reporting on coronavirus really does bring additional stress. And this really does apply anyway, but acknowledging with staff that it's not easy right now and that it's okay to talk about it was really important for her. And she'd also set up a Slack channel for like lighthearted content. So yeah, I'm really glad that you raised that, Sam. It's also key to be transparent about all the available options for help that are available to staff. So Stacey Marie Ishmael, the editorial director of the Texas Tribune, who also was one of the journalists behind the Newsroom Guide to COVID-19, which is a really great online resource that goes through all of this stuff, looking after yourself, like personally, but also at work, and with some guidance on employers there as well. She was really keen to get across that it's really important that you make more transparent what's available to employees. So if you have employee assistance programs, to let employees know at this point and normalize them. So she said she was really open with her staff about her own mental health because she wants to make sure that she's really modeling to her team that it's completely normal to need or seek help, and so that they don't have to feel like they need to apologize if they're stressed out or worried. And finally, she also spoke about the obsession with hyperproductivity, kind of what you were saying earlier, Sam, and that it's important to kind of let go of the idea that staff can do anything and everything that you throw at them. Will Moy, the chief executive of Full Fact, also said that teams tackling coronavirus misinformation really have to recognize that there is a limit to what people can do, especially when people are facing a lot of challenges. So while these things are important all the time and aren't specific to reporting on coronavirus, it's really important to not overload staff, to encourage them to take their breaks, and just being flexible, reasonable, and compassionate.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah, and that's such an important point about being realistic about productivity. Like certainly in my own experience, just because of the work that First Draft does, and because there's so much like information out there about coronavirus right now, you know, it's in part, you know, I feel like, you know, we were built for this moment, but also just to recognize that there's so much that we can do out there, but perhaps we don't have like the time and resources to do all of it. And then so just being realistic about what I can actually achieve, and like thinking about like you know, what is achievable and what is like the most valuable like contributions that I can like make in this like period of time with the resources that I have is, you know, incredibly like important as well. And I know that this applies not just for journalists or for organizations like working on like mis or disinfo, but like also to like human rights like organizations as well. So, so just a couple of things that we ourselves like do at like First Draft. So we've started having virtual workout classes like over lunch. We have like a virtual lunch table, like a standing like a Google Hangout link that, you know, people can join if they miss like having lunch together in the office. And sometimes like virtual like happy hours on Zoom like after work. Much like what Sam was talking about at Amnesty, we have like a different Slack channels for sharing like a funny content. We have a Moment of Zen like channel, and also a channel for wins where we can talk about share links about like the work that we've done, like, you know, being in the news, or thanking or congratulating each other for like amazing things that we've done. So that's, you know, an important way of like staying connected and kind of acknowledging like everybody's like work. And we also have been trying to do have frequent, consistent communication on multiple platforms like around our own work from home and like leave policies. So, you know, if there's anything else you wanted to add, Sam, about what Amnesty does, and how, or about how your team like manages like productivity like expectations, we'd love to hear about that.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I think around productivity, I think it's important to also make sure people are working on projects at the moment that are going to lead to an output. Mm-hmm. I think, you know, some of this work, you know, there's a time for experimentation. There's a time for trying new things. There's a time for trying new research. I'm not sure that this is it. I think this is a time to make sure that people who are working in stressful environments see fruits of their labor, see that what they're doing, what they're spending their time on actually is being published, is seeing the light of day, is helping people, is pushing forward agendas, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really important. So, you know, if we're being realistic about productivity expectations, and that productivity is not actually leading to real outputs. I mean, not every single time, obviously, it's not always possible, but there is something in the fact that, you know, people doing hard work on traumatic events, if that work doesn't lead to something productive, some kind of valuable output, then it actually becomes more traumatic. It's like, why have I spent my time doing this when it didn't go anywhere? So I think that's something we've been really trying to re-strategize on internally in our team. We had like a lot of simultaneous projects going on at the end of February, which has come down to basically a handful of projects, which we know will actually go somewhere. So I think that that's been one of the really important things. I really buy into what Lydia was saying about managers being very honest about their own mental health. I think that's really, 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 really important. You know, I think it's about that leading from the front. It's about that senior management buying into it. You know, everybody is going to be weak at the moment in some way. And being honest about that as a manager, I think, is really, really, really important.
So for the resources for reporters, we will be sending out Sam's journalism and vicarious trauma report, and also links to the Amnesty International's Crisis Evidence Lab, where they also have a lot of useful like tips and techniques on avoiding like burnout and vicarious trauma. I'll send you links to Lydia's 2 pieces on mental wellness. Also the newsroom guide to COVID-19, which Stacey Marie Ishmael and others have like worked on, is a great resource. And of course, the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma has been doing incredible work like throughout the years on this very topic. And they do have a coronavirus like specific portal as well. So we will definitely be sending out all these links afterwards. And then we'll direct you to the First Draft Coronavirus portal as well, which, as Nell mentioned, will have a lot of tips on not just about mental health, but also about like fact checking and verification, monitoring, all of that good stuff. So if we can address like any questions now, then we're ready to answer some audience questions and comments.
Sure, we have a question. If one of our newsroom journalists is taken ill with the virus, how do we help maintain a sympathetic and positive atmosphere for the rest of the team?
I think sorry, I've just jumped straight in there, Victoria. Is that okay?
Yes,
sorry. I mean, I think so. There's several issues there, right? It's there is a question of this is an ethical question of privacy of that person, right? So you know, I think you need to first of all work with the person who's sick to see what they want to be shared, to see what information they would like to be out there about themselves. And I think we shouldn't be, you know, especially in this situation, we shouldn't be communicating without, you know, agreement with and understanding from the person who themselves is sick, or, you know, in worst case scenarios, horrible case scenarios, with their families, with their loved ones, with their next of kin. I think then it's about transparency. It's about agreeing what level of transparency the person who's sick would like to share, and then making sure that within the team that we're as transparent as we can be about the person, about how they can be, how you can contact their loved ones, their families, what you can do. But it's all about working with the person who's sick and making sure that their needs and their wants and desires are met, really. I mean, because I think that's the person who's you know, who's in the awful situation. Within the team, though, obviously, I think if we're showing the right level of compassion, if we're showing the right level of understanding, if we're showing the right level of transparency that's been agreed upon, I think that then brings out you know, that kind of leveling and that balance within the team. I think it comes from itself if we approach the process in the correct way. Obviously, there are obligations within an organization where, you know, you need to refer that upwards, and that is kind of an obligation. I think human resources needs to know, senior management need to know. But I think it's all about that kind of transparency of information that the person who's affected is happy to have shared, and that's the key. That's where it all comes from.
Completely agree.
Excellent.
But it's hard. I mean, I'm just going to add, it's really hard. You know, it's obviously a really hard and challenging thing, and nobody wants to be in that situation. But, you know, avoiding it and hiding away from it is only going to make it 1,000 times worse.
Thank you, Sam. And I think that's all the time we have today for questions, but I'd love, I think there was a ton of valuable information. Is there any like one key takeaway or one key point that any of our panelists want to share before we wrap up today's webinar?
Oh man, that's a tough one. Like one key takeaway, I guess, like, you know, the one thing I wanted to emphasize is, you know, like just this is a really incredibly like a tough like situation, an unprecedented situation to be in, and in a way that we're all kind of like making this up as we go along. But just, you know, thank you so much to like everyone on this call for like all the incredible work that you've been doing. Like what you're doing is actually, you know, incredibly like essential service like for the public. So thank you so much for that. Like we see you. We appreciate like all the great work that you do. And if you have any questions or comments for us, you can respond to like the follow-up email and like send them, or send your questions along, or you can contact us on Twitter, and we'd love to keep having this discussion with you.
If I was going to have one takeaway, I think it's be kind. Be kind to yourselves. Most importantly, I think we're often the harshest on ourselves. So I think this is a time to be really kind and generous with ourselves, and be forgiving if you have moments of weakness, of anxiety. I think by being kind to yourself, it will help it pass.
Thank you to everyone for joining First Drafts and reporting on coronavirus webinar series. I'm Victoria Kwan, and thank you to Sam Dubberly and Lydia Moorish for joining us today, and to Nell, of course. And thank you to the audience for your comments and also for the work you do. So if you have any questions, like please do feel free to get in touch. And for additional resources, you can go to First Draft's coronavirus portal at firstdraftnews.com/coronavirus, which we'll send to you as well. But thank you, and we hope you stay safe and healthy, and have a great day.